Before we start, I wanted to take just a personal note. I have had the good fortune of knowing Commissioner O'Reilly for the better part of a decade. You know, a long time ago, when we were both a little younger, and I was a little less gray, we both worked in the Senate. And Mike was one of the very first people I met on some very early IP transition issues that he was working on. I can't say that my boss, who was and his boss at the time, were anywhere near on the same sort of ideological spectrum, to put not too fine a point on it, but our bosses respected each other, and I respected Mike because he was one of the most thoughtful staffers. And I can tell you that the incentive auction bill, that somebody was also there, it was being developed, would not have come to creation had it not been for Mike's diplomacy between the House folks who he knew very well and his longtime friends in the Senate who he'd done policy work with. So really, as our industry looks forward and we look out, and you wonder how things get done, they get done by people like Mike O'Reilly, as a congressional staffer, doing the right thing. Mike is, when we all started in 2003, if you asked us which one of us is most likely to be a member of the FCC commissioner, I think Mike definitely would have been most people's vote as the most qualified and most capable of doing this job. And so, as former staff, it is always sort of I'll take another personal note, great when we move up from the staff chair to the principal's chairs, and I think our industry can have no greater advocate. The commission can have no better friend and thinker on these issues for us than Commissioner O'Reilly, and I want to extend my personal congratulations again and thank him for being here. And I will start out with sort of the first question that I asked Commissioner Clyburn. We're at a conference here today talking about the emergence of all sorts of new technologies and innovations and sort of the reimagining of the world we live in. And yet the FCC struggles on time to keep up with the technological pace with a series of rules designed for an era 20, 40, 70 years ago. You've been sort of an articulate spokesman for regulatory humility over the years and about how the agency needs to manage the fast-moving technology, but still is constrained by a regulatory environment that's not particularly flexible. So generally, as you approach your role as commissioner, what is sort of your regulatory philosophy? What are your goals as commissioners that you're trying to sort of push forward from your new perch?
Well, thank you, James, and thank you for having me here. I appreciate the opportunity to be before you. I've known TIA and worked with your association for over 20 years. James and I, as he mentioned, were able to work together and sometimes on different sides of issues, and that's understandable. But at the end of the day, he highlighted it well. We had respect for each other and each other's positions. So I understand you had an opportunity, or will have an opportunity to talk to Commissioner Clyburn. I have a slightly different approach overall, and that's okay. My approach is when I consider IP transitions and what's the future going to look like, I kind of approach it on this mindset. What are the absolute minimist requirements that we have to have going forward? What do we absolutely have to maintain? What's gotta go to the future? And then I take back and say, okay, from everything else that's left, does it have to stay or not? And most times it can pretty much go. And then the second part of that equation is, what do we do with the folks that haven't transitioned yet, the companies that are going to take a little bit longer? And in that case, because we don't want the regulatory framework to make decisions for companies, we want companies to make decisions. So it is to reduce that burden on existing companies and reduce their regulatory obligations. And so we have a parity and let the market drive to IP rather than government.
And clearly, the most significant issue sort of out of this vein has been the Commission's recent decision to classify broadband services under Title II of the Communications Act. It has really almost unimaginable consequences for the industry and how it's going to move forward. Since I would like, for everybody who doesn't necessarily have the opportunity to follow the daily ins and outs, if you could sort of go through how you think the Commission ultimately arose at that decision and why you felt so fundamentally that it was the wrong course of action for the agency to take.
Appreciate the question. It's very tough for me to get in my colleague's head because I should start by saying to the industry, I'm sorry. The commission has imposed new restrictions on your business model that are going to be untold and expensive for decades to come, assuming that they sustain court and congressional review. But so I believe my colleagues, and again, that I leave it to them, but I'll just, based on my experience, I believe my colleagues analyzed every possible horrible they thought might happen in this space, and then they tried to figure out what's the best way to provide as much authority to the commission to address those hypothetical concerns. I like to call it guilt by imagination. They thought of every single component that you possibly could and what might go wrong, and then they threw on both Section 706 and Title II and said, we are going to make sure none of that happens. It's kind of like, I was trying to figure an analogy, it's almost like going camping for the first time. You're like, well, I need one of those, and I better buy a canoe, and I better buy one of those, and you walk out with just an upteen amount of material. And I think that's where you have a bunch of scenarios that they built into their head, and then they put as much authority as they could into the commission's hands to regulate going forward in any scenario. And then I think there's a second part of that equation, I would say, and that is, there was a great interest in revitalizing the commission's authority overall. There had been concerns that as companies move to more internet communications technologies, I say that in a broad sense, as companies move to new opportunities, that the commission's relevancy and role was shrinking and has continued to shrink and will shrink. And so there was an effort to revitalize that, and by expanding the scope of Title II into areas that I disagree with, we're going to find that the commission is more relevant in your business models and into many different, I say it stretches that discussion all the way through the edge providers going forward. I think that's very damaging, and so I disagree with it. It's the second part of your question, my concerns with the structure, not only the framework I just outlined, but I have deep concerns with trying to analyze what the market may happen in those experiences that haven't happened today. People talk about paid prioritization. You can talk about throttling all you want, but take about paid prioritization for just 1 minute. Here's something that has not been done at all, but we've already declared it problematic, and we're going to actually have to ban it ahead of time instead of let's see how it develops, and then if it becomes something that we need to address, that's one thing. But we are determining ahead of the time it must be stopped. I just think that's the wrong course of action. And I also think that in the second part of my answer is I think the remedy to these list of horribles is completely the wrong direction. Both Title II and 706, the authority they've given to the commission is extremely troubling. And it's not just the 3 bright line rules that Chairman Wheeler and colleagues have articulated. It's the other issues that we have no idea how they're going to be decided, and they've left up to staff to resolve at some point. You think of things like, what's a specialized service in this new going forward world? What's reasonable network management in a going forward world? And what's our general conduct standard, where it's basically we will see it, we'll regulate it when we see it, when we know it kind of scenario. So I'm extremely problematic. I'm hopeful and slightly optimistic that the courts will address this in a favorable light.
Sort of following up on that vein, for all of the things that the FCC still has to do to ultimately clarify what it means with this order, how many more, assuming the rules stand for a bit of time, how many years of uncertainty are we facing? The FCC just came out with a notice saying broadband providers subject to privacy, not the old rules, but new rules we need to make. And we all know that unfortunately the agency's rulemaking speed at sometimes is lacking. So as folks are trying to make business decisions, do you foresee months of uncertainty unless the court, even the court acts quickly? How fast do you see the FCC getting some of these current unknowns knowable to folks?
I wish I could say months. It's actually going to be multiple years. And if you look at what the commission did in privacy in its recent guidance from the Enforcement Bureau, they said, at some point we're going to do rules, or we may do rules. We're not sure yet, but in the meantime, you basically have to do good things. Is the best you can describe it, and that how that's to be determined is in the Enforcement Bureau's eyes. They get to determine whether the practices that are being used and articulated and being done every day are acceptable in their eyes. It's almost like a parent relationship. They have an opportunity to say, my children's doing well, but I don't like what they're doing here, so I want it fixed. We have no idea what that means. It provides no certainty. We were told, actually, that the industry was asking for this. And so I went back and talked to a bunch of folks and said, gee, is this something you were seeking? And the answer was, oh my goodness gracious, no. This provided even more uncertainty. And so there's just one example of up-teen number of items that are going to fall in this space where you're not going to have any clarity. I was talking to some folks recently, and one of the general counsels was suggesting, well, it was more than suggestion. It was their personal experience and what's happening from the innovators, the engineers in their company. And they were calling up every day to the general counsel saying, well, can I do this? Is this going to be a violation? And they'd say, actually, that probably is really close. And you better, I'd be very careful about that, which of course means you're not going to do that, right? What company is going to throw money on something that's maybe possible and maybe not, might be a violation, maybe not? Then the engineer would say, well, what if I did it this way instead? And they'd say, nope, you still got, you're violating the spirit of what the commission's going after, and you're in trouble area. So we're already seeing the impacts today. We're already seeing innovation being slowed. We're already seeing companies deciding not to do things that they normally would have done, and it would have increased the viability of the company and also brought all the benefits to consumers. So we're having that it is in effect already today. And to the central theme of your question, I think it's going to go on for a number of years, assuming that neither the courts or Congress address this action.
And I think that is the uncertainty and the regulatory overhang, in its impact on investment and the supply chain and TI's members who are, looking to sell more and having more clarity from their customers as to what they need. It certainly has been, talked about a fair amount over the last several days. And we want to thank you for sort of the vigilance on this issue, because it is uncertainty. And I know no business has a perfect clarity about their future, but the regulatory uncertainty has got a negative impact, I think, for TIA's members as they try to plan and meet their customers' needs. The next topic I want to talk to is, I think, clearly, the net neutrality decision and order took a huge amount of the agency's bandwidth and time.
Sure.
And it certainly, whether one agrees or disagrees, was a landmark sort of proceeding in some respects. But really, the next most significant issue facing the agency is the incentive auction, which is, the agency's been working hard on for a bit of time and still has a fair amount of work to do.
That's right.
There was some chatter that right after the very successful AWS-3 auction that it was time to rethink the incentive auctions, and should we keep it on the same time frame? Should we slow it down? Just sort of get your thoughts on the status of the incentive auction, right direction, wrong direction, good time frame, not great time frame.
Sure. So I'll start with my most basic premise that I'm comfortable with the timeline that the chairman has outlined. Assuming that we can finish our work, we have a number of items before the commission. Assuming we can complete our work in time, I'm comfortable with and he has outlined a time frame of the first quarter of 2016 calendar year, so somewhere January, February, March of next year. I'm comfortable with that timeline. What I have said is, though, I will continue to be vigilant and listen to any arguments on legitimate arguments on why that timing should be delayed. I am not interested in any way delaying the auction except for legitimate reasons. And there are a number of arguments that have been presented so far, but they haven't materialized in any specific asks of the commission. We've heard from anecdotal evidence that the wireless carriers need some time to recapitalize or figure out some of the things that are happening in the marketplace as we speak. And we've heard from the broadcasters and some anecdotal evidence that they're going to have problems in terms of the repacking process and finding tower teams to build and to relocate towers to make sure that the existing broadcasters who are not participating can still move forward in the timeline that we've outlined. So there's just two examples. There's probably many more, but we are not to that point yet. I have not had official request. So I am still moving forward that we will be, at this, before this, we should be probably pretty close to being done with an incentive auction by next year. We still have at the commission somewhere between 8 and 10 items that need to be resolved, and they're of smaller, from big to small. Some of them will happen after we start the auction, but they have important decisions to be made. In some instances, we are undoing some bad decisions that we've previously made, which I always find to be helpful. There are issues that I had highlighted and wish the commission had been more thoughtful in the past, and now they're coming along to my perspective. So that's always healthy to hear. So the broad answer is, I certainly hope that we can move forward on that timeline, but we have to make sure that we produce a successful auction, because a failed auction helps absolutely nobody. It doesn't help consumers, it doesn't help broadcasters or wireless companies, it doesn't help Congress, and it certainly doesn't help the FCC. So we have to produce a successful auction. As James alluded to, I worked on the statute, and hopefully it's a sound statute that will work. I think there are a lot of people doing really hard work to make that happen.
As former congressional staff, there are no such things as bad statute we write, just poor implementation from the agency standpoint, until you actually flip to the other side, and then you realize how sometimes the best legislative ideas wind up slightly not to be quite as brilliant as you once thought. But a little bit of policy humility does everyone good in time. Another key wireless issue that our members are deeply engaged in is the 3.5 gigahertz band, which you've referred to the innovation band. There are significant interest for our members here and the whole ICT manufacturers and suppliers, who are going to ultimately build these devices. You generally supported the FCC's recent decision on order on the issue, but had some reservations. Like, if you could take a minute to explain sort of your reservations on that and your thoughts on how some of those that could ultimately be improved.
Sure, and I should start from a broader perspective and say, the paradigm that my colleagues have talked about in the 3.5, this new sharing paradigm that from now on will continue to do sharing, I think I've articulated is not necessarily the accurate one. I think we're still going to have a mixture of scenarios. We heard this from the previous speaker. They talked about sharing and being an important component. I believe it's an important component. We're still going to need cleared spectrum. We're still going to need licensed spectrum. And so that's going to have to be part of the equation. That means finding new spectrum. That means, God bless our good DOD, we're going to need to push them forward to remove and reduce their amount of spectrum. And that means, making more spectrum available. In the 3.5 space, I wholeheartedly support the item. There were parts, though, that I think I have concerns with the details, and was trying to get, my colleagues to focus on. This one particular is the priority access licenses. So we've kind of set it up where we'll protect the incumbents, and then we have kind of two different models. You have the priority access licenses for those that actually wanted to get a license, and then the rest is generally, we call it GAA, but it's basically going to be unlicensed. For those companies that want to get a license because they want some certainty, and I imagine it's a number of the companies that you partner with, we've built a mechanism where you can't get a license unless somebody else shows up to compete against you. So in those scenarios, you're talking about if 5 companies show up and they want that particular the amount of spectrum and the license band, and they're going to fight for it, great. But what happens when you're the only one that shows up and you're trying to build a network across an entire city and nobody else is there? You're the only guy. What happens? Well, the commission made a decision that you can't get a license. You just have to operate in an unlicensed scenario. And then at some point future, there might be a license for that piece if somebody else shows up. I mean, you could see a scenario where, or you could see it playing out where companies will beg other people just to get into to an auction so they could win a license on something that they can have some certainty in building out a network. I believe that small cells are very important. They've been slow to develop. We shouldn't overestimate how fast that's going to happen. There are a number of problems from just getting backhaul to the issues, just getting rights of way. Those are very tremendous issues that must be resolved. And then how do you make money off this network? How do you, if you're building a priority access license for backhaul or whatever the scenario in your wireless provider, how economic is it? Is an ongoing question that we're going to have to be faced. So we've called it, the commission has referred to it as the innovation ban. I've had, if I had a third area of concern, it's that we've thrown a lot of different experiments into one space. And usually when you do that, you can't measure which one's working and which one isn't. So I've talked about the framework a little bit, but when you throw a bunch of different things at it, you can't tell was that the right one or was this the one that worked? And what's the problem? How do you all figure it out?
And sort of another topic that has dominated the conversation for the last couple of days here is the development of 5G and how that portends for our entire industry and could be a complete game changer again across the board as it gets rolled out in the years to come. The FCC has recently, as you know, opened a notice of inquiry regarding millimeter wave technologies. You have, as always, been sort of careful to note while these bands may play an important role in 5G, lower band spectrum will also be important. Where do you think the policy on 5G and millimeter wave spectrum is headed, and the FCC's roles, and what you'd like to see?
So I'm optimistic that the Commission and supportive of what the Commission has done so far, and my colleagues and I have worked together on an item you mentioned. The upper bands are going to be crucial in that part of the equation. But as I talk to different folks in your space, and I try to ask them, well, how do you define 5G? What do you see as the definition of 5G going forward? And each one has a slightly different definition. And then they would first come forward and say, we're working on that in standard-setting bodies internationally. And I think that's very thoughtful, and that's you certainly don't want me defining what 5G is. You certainly don't want the Commission defining what 5G is, and so I'm interested in seeing what happens in those bodies. And that's a very thoughtful way. We've had very successful experiences in the past with standard-setting bodies. What a recent concern that has shown itself, and certainly domestically and also internationally, is that the standard setting body is becoming a little bit more, bodies are becoming a little bit more, is there an effort to try to either manipulate or tilt the playing field, both by the makeup and by the number of people that are involved in the process, for both domestic in terms of one coming onside one or the other, or is it a nationalistic perspective that certain companies or certain countries have a viewpoint that they're trying to push because they want to be the leader of 5G. They're annoyed. They're more than annoyed. They're despondent on the success the United States has had in being a leader on 4G, and they're committed to making sure that doesn't happen in 5G world. And so they're interested in doing as much as they can in the standard setting body to kind of tilt that playing field. And I have said, and I commit to you, if I can be of any assistance, and I will be actively watching this process. I don't want to be involved in the standard setting body, but I don't want the standard setting body to be abused. So I think that's part of the equation. You alluded to earlier, and the first part of your question is, I don't believe that you can define 5G to just be the upper bands. We're also going to need some of the lower bands under 6 gig. And I was talking to some folks, and they were talking about Japan's looking at in the 4 gig space. And so we're going to have a combination of different bands that are part of this overall equation.
Well, thank you. And I think the industry looks forward to sort of your leadership as the regulatory bodies move forward and trying to sort of figure this out and find ways to enable the next generation of technologies. Sort of a common theme throughout your comments is clearly there are processes and issues at the Commission that in a lot of people's views, don't work as well or as efficiently or as transparently as they should. We asked Commissioner Clyburn sort of her thoughts on that, and it's a little bit different sort of viewpoint when you're a majority commissioner versus a minority commissioner, but you've had the opportunity to serve both the legislative side of things, now as an agency principal. In your tenure over the last couple of years, things you change, things you keep, things that work well that you were surprised, and things that work worse than you had anticipated.
It's a very, very thoughtful question. So you're right. I do turn back to my past experience in working with you in many different settings. I was both in the majority, and at other times I was in the minority in my congressional time period. So I know the experiences. I am in the minority now at the FCC, and I respect that. I understand that role, and I enjoy it and I thrive in it. But there are certain things that we can do to make the process better for everybody and the Commission to operate. So I'm not interested, I'm of no belief that any reform proposal that I put forward is going to change any outcome. We've had about 300 decisions since in the last 19 months that I've been there. And unless, there are very few instances where my colleagues have dissented amongst each other. We just had one recently, but dissented among each other, that it's a handful, 4 or 5 items where they haven't been completely supportive of each other's positions. So my opinion only matters so much. In those other instances, I just outright lost. No matter what I was seeking, whatever I was recommending, it's healthy that my colleagues have, in a number of instances I've already referenced, are coming back to some of my positions that I suggested in the past. So that's healthy, that's happening. But in those previous votes, I lost, and so I'm not expecting to win anything, and I'm not intending in any way by making recommendations to change the outcome. The chairman is still going to have complete authority over staff. For instance, we have about 1,500 people at the commission. And the chairman oversees 1,500 people. I oversee 5. So put that in perspective. He's still going to oversee 1,500 people. He's still going to set the agenda, which is so important in actually determining who's going to win an item. So I've put forward a number of ideas. I'm probably at about 8 ideas, and I've got another 8 or 9 that I'm working on putting forward to change the conversation. The one that I'm really interested in, I think is so important, my colleagues have not, after some early consideration, I think have changed their thought process and now are completely opposed to it. But I wish they would reconsider, because what I have sought, as many of you know, 3 weeks before one of our meetings, the major items that we vote in a meeting once a month are put before the commission. So they're sent to the offices. And what I have said is, at that time, so 21 days in advance, take that item and put it on the website and let everyone digest exactly what we're talking about. I am not interested in delaying that item in any capacity. I just think we're going to get better, thoughtful comments from people that may not know exactly what's happening in the details until you actually see the document. I have sat through hundreds of meetings where people are advocating things to me. Please change this. Will you please change this? And under our current rules, I'm prohibited from even telling them that the thing that they're talking about is not even relevant for the conversation. That what they're chasing is a rabbit when we're hunting deer. So I'm prohibited from that. I'm also prohibited from telling them what I'm already trying to seek to change. So, if you come to me and say, look, we really needed this part to the change in this item on incentive auction or whatever circumstance, I can't tell you, what, I'm already working on that. It'd be great if we were working together. I can't do that. I just got to sit there and listen to your concerns and acknowledge and then go back and then say, okay, I agree or I disagree. It's very problematic, and that provides upteen problems. And if you're able to actually see the document, you'll be able to know where to focus your attention and exactly provide new opportunities and new ideas. And maybe it's, sometimes it's tweaks and sometimes it can be complete rewrites. But we should be able to, consider those thoughtful perspectives rather than people shooting in the dark. And so that's one example of something I think would be very helpful. My colleagues are so worried that it's going to disrupt our internal negotiations. Well, I kind of alluded to it a little bit before. There's not a heck of a lot of negotiations when I'm losing in a lot of instances, and they're always winning. So there's only so much that. But my colleagues are great, and they're good friends. So I don't mean to make too much light of that scenario. But it is. I do not believe that it would undo or hamper in any way our internal dialogue, and it would not slow down items in any way.
No, and it's, again, as I talked about earlier, these process issues matter because it affects the speed and the tone and the tenor of the final outcome. And so even though it's sort of definitely inside the beltway and may not be immediately relevant to your business model, ultimately it's critical to the policies that are developed. And so I think that's why this conversation is important for TI members to have and understand where you're coming from. And we appreciate, I think, the drive for more transparency. And so the last sort of question is,
Sure.
Over the years, we both had at some point chased a telecom rewrite as a good idea. I just spoke with Commissioner Clybert about the challenges of a regulator making policy under a statute that widely considered dated, but yet there's no consensus as to how to change it. Knowing, again, from your experience, scrap it and start over, find 4 or 5 things to change to reflect the realities, now that you sort of have the perspective of the implementer and not just sort of the drafter?
Sure. It's a tough question, and I always answer this. Yeah, this is a popular question on a number of situations, but I always answer it the same way, and that is, first, I leave those decisions on drafting and consideration of legislation and what to do in that space. I leave that to my former colleagues and current friends on the Hill to decide. They're in the best position to determine what can and can't be done based on the committees that they're working on and what the timing of certain things can be and where the push points are and what kind of, so I leave it to their capable hands. But I will highlight, there has been this question about the rewrite, and whether you call it a rewrite or just an update, a modernization effort, whatever the term may be. I think it's important to have. I think it's a dialogue that should continue, because you constantly want the statute to be as best as it can match up with the current circumstances in the marketplace. And that's so. I think the statute that we worked on in '96, there are many parts that are outdated. I would spend, if you ask me where I'd spend some time, I would spend some great deal of time on the video side. Video is exploding in the internet. And what's happening and how much is dominating the internet traffic. We're 67. We're going to get to 67% of traffic is going to be internet traffic is going to be wireless, and we're going to be at a point where it's in the high 80s where it's internet traffic. So you put those things together. I would spend a great deal of time there if I was my previous job. They're the issues that we have to work on behalf of the Congress in my current job, and we just have to live and deal with the statute as it's currently written. So those are areas that I would work on, but I have to leave the bulk of it to my former colleagues.
Well, and I want to thank you. As Scott alluded to, with Commissioner O'Reilly, you're always going to get an honest opinion, clear sort of statements of where he is. He has always listened, as you said, to a good argument and modified his views on what he understands the facts. And those are the types of policymakers that we need more of in Washington. And we want to thank Commissioner O'Reilly for coming down here and spending his time with us, because there are lots of demands on it. And I hope everyone has found the conversation as enlightening, as interesting, and the entire TIA and ICT space wants to continue working with you to sort of push the policies forward that allow our entire industry to continue to grow. And again, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for your attention. Thank you so much.